Welcome to Cancer Talks, a podcast sharing stories of personal transformation and collective healing from people who have been touched by cancer. My name is Claire DeLaslo, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. Our guest, Jade Young, describes herself as a spiritual midwife. Jade spent the first 20 years of her professional life building a consulting business. When her mother was diagnosed with cancer, Jade returned to Hawaii to be with her family. Following her mother's death, Jade spent years grieving, healing, and slowing down. She said goodbye to the Bay Area and goodbye to consulting. For the 20 years since, Jade has been deepening her spiritual practice and offering herself as an instrument of peace and healing in the dying process and beyond. Jade reminds us that healing is not a rush job. As she puts it, you cannot force the river. In order to become an instrument of healing, Jade first had to let herself heal, and in order to let herself heal, she had to move from the fast lane to the big island and ask the ocean to hold her grief. This conversation winds and circles back on itself many times, just like the process of grieving. Thank you for listening.
I think it'd be appropriate just to offer a bit of a blessing for this time together.
Yeah.
And just to say, may this time be a blessing for all those who may run across it, all those who have participated with it, or for you and I and Annie and Cheryl and whoever whose life and relationships may be touched by many of the topics we're talking about. Because, I think this is a very profound human phenomenon we're discussing here. And it's really such an honor to be able to be interviewed today.
Thank you for that blessing, Jade. I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
Yes. I'm glad to know we have a little room to have a few detours, because I know I do tend to detour.
Yeah.
I like to let people know I'm not always logical linear,
Mm-hmm.
especially on a topic like this where it's such so many threads come together.
Yeah. Yeah. I really believe that it's not the majority of the world who is logical linear, even though, the structures we live in are set up to privilege those who think in straight and rational ways. So especially when we're talking about this experience of cancer, it's so important to be able to have very human, might even say feminine kinds of dialogue that wander and follow our emotional states. And
well, also the whole emotional landscape, and I would dare say as human beings, if you look at the human body, there's no right angles. There are no straight lines. It's all curves.
Yeah.
Every single part.
Yeah.
I just noticed that. That's interesting.
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering, I'm wanting to hear a little more about the spiritual preparation you are doing ahead of this conversation.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. It's not anything formal that I do. I often feel that, I have been involved with this work really as a calling, you might say, much more than, it was on my top 10 list and I wanted to study it and get a degree in it and sort of do that route. And often when I would visit with families or when I was working in a hospital in Oakland, I would always pause at the door to the, patient's room before I went in and just say a quiet prayer or a meditation. And a lot of it had to do with just asking that I be an instrument of healing. that this was not about my agenda or my good ideas, but that there really is something much larger at work here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many of us have tuned into that, but many have not tuned into it as well. And, but it really is allowing something, I think, far deeper, just something far more authentic to come through than just what our own personal mind or education can provide.
Bigger than us.
So, yeah, much, much bigger than us, the vastness of the universe, if you might say, or the vastness of spirit, with a capital S, and which goes beyond any particular religious identification or spiritual tradition, but it's that sort of life force, which I think permeates everything everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And then this is also making me want to hear a little bit about your origins in spirituality. You went to divinity school, right? Is this true?
Yeah. Man, and is it true? I love that question because a lot of people were shocked. I think, it doesn't appear that I would be leaning in that direction, because I can also be a very practical, pragmatic, down to earth, results driven person. And I think have been I'm going to say the first half of my life, when we're out to accomplish or kind of make our mark on the world. And, my own personal joke about going to divinity school was that I now have papers to prove that I'm certified divine. Like we're certified organic,
right?
And I'm certified divine. So anyway, but that's so that I don't take any of this too seriously. Having a credential has very little to do with this work. It's a place where you can go and focus on a lot of, and find maybe some very powerful education and resources, and then also put it into practice. So it becomes experiential. And I will say something which I find interesting, because I've always wondered about this, this profession, which is still a relatively young profession, the work of hospice or end of life care, even though as humans, we've always done this, I think.
Of course.
Every tribe, culture, country, peoples have had their own ways of dealing with the process of death and dying. And then a lot of it often gets lost along the way.
Right.
And anyway, we'll probably get into some of it as we get into this conversation. But I think in our so-called contemporary culture these days, too often, I think the medical establishment has taken over the conversation, you might say.
Right.
And also has really, yes. And no doubt some wonderful things we can be grateful for in terms of medication and technology and tests and, many, many things that are wonderful tools. But they've at the same time have excluded other aspects, because they're only looking at the material, physical, physiology, the biology of a person, rather than the whole person.
So could we begin by hearing the origin story of your spiritual midwifing practice?
Well, goodness. I like that you're referring to it as an origin story. That's a really interesting perspective, because I would say, yes, prior to really my entry point was about 30 years ago, when my mother, who I'm very close to, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And at that time, I was in my early to mid 40s, and I had a business. So that was my orientation, accomplishing clients, building the practice. I had a consulting practice and worked with senior executives. And it was a very sudden diagnosis that really caught us off guard. And so she had been healthy up to that point, and then all of a sudden she was having abdominal pains. And after going to the doctor, they ran tests, which of course is a typical procedure, and then they did a biopsy and discovered, for so many of us, that dreaded word, cancer. And to have the diagnosis come back when, it's just out of nowhere, this word now appears in your life and it takes center stage. So it was definitely very shocking. It was sudden. It was very disruptive in the sense of, we're all going along. Again, it's like the pandemic, thinking everything is normal, natural. We're used to our patterns and what we do. And then something very sudden and critical happens. So that's where I would say her diagnosis became, of course, the most all important thing for my family.
Yeah.
And I will say that I also come from a medical background. I have an older brother who's a surgeon, many uncles who are heart surgeons, cardiologists, ear, nose, throat specialists, oncologists, internal medicine. So, it's in the background.
Yeah.
And so part of this, I'm going to say, introduction to a whole new aspect of life, which I had never even thought much about. The other word that enters into the conversation is terminal. And most of us don't even think of terminal, especially when you're still relatively young. I'm going to say I felt young in my 40s. We still think life will go on forever. And especially when things are thriving, you expect them to continue thriving and flourishing. So it's a rude awakening. And yet down the road, I will say, if we then, I can look back on it now, but only in retrospect, would I be able to say, it was a huge blessing in disguise. And as much as a cliche that sounds, there's so much truth in that. And we can unpack that and discuss that.
What was the family constellation like at the time of your mom's diagnosis? Who was in the frame?
Oh, interesting question too. Well, I have two older brothers. I'm the youngest and the only girl. And my father was still alive, and my mom. So that was the immediate nuclear family. We have a large extended family, meaning my mother comes from a very large Chinese. I'm of Chinese origin. And so she had 9 brothers and sisters. And given they were the first generation to be educated, I just want to make a point about that was a very important piece of becoming more part of the Western mentality, right. Western medicine, Western education.
Yeah.
So the whole worldview is, by now, for my parents, the doctors really are the authorities in this field. So they would look to them for direction and for, I'm going to say, really strong belief in the medical system, which I think was a big factor in this.
In the Western medical system?
Yes, in the Western medical system.
Is anyone in your family still practicing either indigenous medicines or Chinese medicine?
No, not so much. I would say I've never practiced it professionally, but I've always been drawn to it.
Yeah.
I remember even in high school, and this wasn't any formal study, but I always felt the influence and the relationship with Mother Nature, that could be a healing source.
Yeah.
That even something like music could be a healing source. And that I then later on, even because most of the doctors our family went to were Western doctors, noticed that things like they prescribed, let's say a simple thing as a cough, the cough medicine made me feel worse. So I would throw away all the medication that I ever got from a quote unquote Western doctor. And it was then that I started going to a Chinese medicine, to an acupuncturist, and just noticed that the results and how I felt were just so much. There was so much more, I would say, I'm going to use the word well-being and wellness that I experienced. And, without the nausea, without side effects, that kind of thing that I often felt from Western medicine. So I think even all those small things added up to, for me, developing more of a faith or confidence in some of these, what I would call non-traditional approaches.
Yeah. So your mother has received a diagnosis, and the doctor said it's terminal.
Right.
Is that true?
Yeah.
And your family's all in the frame. And what's the journey between that and your role, your calling as a spiritual midwife?
Well, I would have to say, and I say this really owning it, but death and dying was not a topic that I had ever studied or spent time with. So this was my first direct, personal, close, upfront experience with someone that I loved, someone that I knew, someone that I had now, my mother and I had developed also the kind of relationship where it was not just mother-daughter, but had transcended to woman, woman, which is extraordinary what becomes available when you can now see your mother instead of the woman who nagged you all the time as a woman full of beauty and joy and wisdom who had her own challenges in life, her own struggles, I'm sure. So
I got full body chills when you said that.
oh, well, yeah. And so for me, this was, I'm just going to say it was just one of the most difficult things I had ever encountered, dealing with the potential and now learning that my mother was not only ill, but terminal. So, it's that the level of the intellectual awareness, which means there's an end and it may come sooner than you anticipated. And the doctors, of course, gave her that 6-month proverbial, life sentence. And yet she passed within less than 2 months. So that was another shocking thing. And my elder brother, who was still practicing medicine at that time as an OBGYN, but still, part of that whole medical establishment and worldview, she had the best medical care, clearly, that was known at the time. But for the rest of us, because we were very ignorant, I would say, of what goes on internally, there's what I would call not just the external part of the disease condition, and then the possible treatments and because she slipped into a coma, also that now added to the mix, which made it even more complicated. So the procedure they had hoped to do was now no longer viable. And thank God I knew at least that my mother, that when people slip into a coma, they can still hear you. So I would visit her as often as I could and talk to her and ask her if she could hear me to please squeeze my hand. So she squeezed my hand on several occasions. And it's sometimes those small yet powerful moments of connection with no words, that touch was so powerful. But the piece that was so missing for me, even though I realized she was receiving the best kind of comfort care, we could say, when the medical team has decided like there's nothing else we can do in terms of treatment, they eventually took her off the life support system because they knew there would be no sort of recovery possible. And there was no awareness, though, of the personal emotional loss that the family could be experiencing. So what I would call the whole emotional landscape, the inner workings, the impact of losing a mother, I think was just, no one spoke about it. It just felt like it was invisible and maybe to some degree overlooked. I would say it was a very overlooked, and yet that was part of the whole entire process, the experience of loss and really the pain of it, the emotional pain, which I think also culturally we're not very good at addressing or even acknowledging the legitimacy and the beauty. There's something that may sound odd, but as well as there can be profound sadness over the loss, there's also that sort of maybe bittersweetness or, that's part of it.
Connection.
Yeah. And, realizing that here was now this beautiful woman that I had now gotten to so respect. And just in the background, why it's significant for me was I had spent many years of my life, especially during college and in my younger adult life, really at odds with my mother. So I would say there was a fair amount of what I would call some of the usual, mother-daughter conflict and thinking your mother's old-fashioned and she doesn't really know anything and diminishing her. And then to be able to really step back and take the larger view, a wider angle, lens, if you will, about her upbringing and what she had to deal with and her life challenges. And then to be able to, she was everyone's favorite aunt. So first of all, what was it about my mother that my other cousins loved so much and I failed to see?
Yeah.
Really, every time people would come up to me and say, "Oh, we love your mother," I would have this very sort of snarky remark and say something like, yes, but you don't live with her, you know?
Right.
And oh my gosh, it was very humbling and yet such a gift to be able to transform all of that gnarly, divisive tension that I had with my mother. So again, it's just that was all part of the mix.
Do you remember one of the first times you were able to talk with someone else about the emotional landscape of her death?
Oh, wow. Yes. And that brings up so many other sort of sub questions along with that, because it was, I would say, first of all, very difficult to talk about it with most people, including my own family, never talked about it. It's even though we were aware and dealing with my mother in the hospital and visiting her, the topic was never mentioned at the dinner table or, with the family. If anything, it was always the medical diagnosis. So she was now treated, to me, related to as her disease condition and not as a human being, this beautiful woman. So the lack of being able to have a safe space to discuss some of the anguish, I'm just going to say, it was something that I was not accustomed to, where actually there was, I'm going to say, this huge ache in my heart. And I've now come to realize it is something we call having a broken heart. When your heart has been devastated through the loss of a loved one, whether it's a mate, a spouse, or a parent, we feel that in our hearts. The physiology is right there. You cannot separate the emotional pain from the physiology of it, I say, because it's all related. And so the first time I was able to then openly and freely, without embarrassment, without somebody else trying to change the subject, was when I met a group of hospice women. I had heard about hospice, but it wasn't readily available, at least in Hawaii at the time, about 30 years ago. And I was now living on the Big Island of Hawaii. And the Big Island, I just want to say, mention something, is as an island culture, it's much more open to spirituality. So it's interesting you should ask that. And that also, I just realized that's actually where my deep healing began. And it started with this group of women, because I had heard about hospice and I knew what it was intellectually, but I had never interacted with people who were in that environment. So I decided I should go to one of these meetings and a hospice support group. And because I was the new person there in the group, they so welcomed me, first of all. I mean, they didn't even know who I was, but they so were gracious and warm and welcoming. Just that heart connection in itself was healing. And then the next thing they did is they asked, would you be willing to tell us your story? Oh my gosh, I had never had anyone really ask me to tell them my story. Like they were interested and they were open. And I would say, again, that was my first direct experience of what we would now call compassionate listening, to be held, to be loved, to be embraced, and that people, each of those women there had also had their own loss of a loved one. So they could relate to how painful that could be. So I have to say it was an extraordinary thing. And through many, many tears, I remember sobbing, at some points, and where you're just, because all of that stored up and pent up emotion now came gushing out, and it doesn't heal overnight. That's the other thing.
No.
But that was like the floodgates opened up. And for me, it also, I would say, it was a huge weight. I could feel that just the enormous, something got lifted, something that had been held back and suppressed. This was now about close to 5 years since my mother had passed. And I had not ever had this kind of opportunity of what I would call deep, authentic listening.
Wow.
Yeah.
And at this point, you were like 45 years old.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
And that it was on the Big Island, I'm going to say, was so significant because I had now moved back from San Francisco. And just very briefly, I think our environment, our extended environment, being in the city, I was still doing a lot of nonprofit work. I was, producing large events. I was still running my business. And it's like we get into that busy mode. Our life is filled with
treadmill.
Yeah. And meaningful things, though. This was things that I loved doing and that I was passionate about. But there's no downtime, sufficient downtime where you can just be present to the pain. And I won't get into it, but there's a lot of research now that's been done about when we are not able to deal with some of that pain and the anguish and the emotional pain of all of it, it gets stored in our body and it has an impact. So, and it can lead to illness. But that's another whole huge topic, which we won't get into at this time.
We could maybe link to an article in the show notes about it. So this important, fateful connection with other hospice women. But at the time, you were just Jade, and were you still working for a nonprofit when you met them?
No, not full time the way I was. Let's just say, the term full tilt boogie. I had been living a very full tilt boogie life, living in the fast lane. And my metaphor for this was I really intentionally took myself out of the fast lane and moved to the Big Island where it's very rural, beautiful green countryside, a much gentler and slower pace of life. And I think that was an important piece of the healing process also.
And how long did it take when did you first start developing this practice with end-of-life care and stepping into that role?
I would say, again, it was, again, these things don't happen overnight. And for me, it wasn't even several months. It was more like a number of years of first being able to personally do a lot of my own inner healing, which I think is an important piece of this, to be able to heal what had been a wound, a very large wounding, that loss. And the other thing that was there in my own personal life at the time was having gone through a rather challenging divorce. That was also, so in hospice, we call it complicated grief. And it's important to mention this because, it's one thing to lose a significant loved one, such as a mother who you're very close to. It's like an emotional pillar in your life that you're losing. And then to lose this other pillar in my life, my own personal relationship, the future, the dreams, the partnership. It was really devastating. So I would say, and I want to mention this as part of the healing process, that it's really different for everyone. And again, for me, given that I didn't have much education in this area, I just noticed that walking along the beach, swimming, hiking, sitting under a waterfall, literally sitting under a waterfall, all of that in a way is part of my healing. And then I went and studied something called transformational yoga. So body work is important for some of us. And just the presence of Mother Nature, again, the Big Island where I live, just to give you an idea, was very rural. There were no traffic lights. It was so safe and so rural. We never locked our doors. We left the keys in the car. So I'm just saying it was just the antithesis of urban living. And I think a lot of that also has an effect of the body has less stress. So I'm not kind of directly answering your question, how did I get into end-of-life care? By the end of, I would say, for this 1 year sabbatical that I thought would be a 1 year living on the Big Island, turned into 5 years.
Nice.
And it was a blessing that I could even do that. But it really just took that kind of time to unwind, to decompress. But what happened as a result, and here's the thing, along the way, I would have these flash of insights, Claire, and I'm going to mention one of them that sort of came to me. I think there were many times, and I want to speak a little bit about the grief process because, grief is one of those things too, where it's a very unpredictable emotion. It was for me. It can be a roller coaster. I mean, I would say a year or two into living on the Big Island, I'd be driving along, and all of a sudden, I would just have this wave of emotion of just feeling sadness and loss, and I would have to pull off the road and just sob. So it was things that were still overwhelming. Sometimes it takes as long as it takes. And this is one thing that one of the hospice women said to me that gave me so much freedom to feel what I was feeling, that this is not a rush job. You can't stamp priority mail on it and, think it's going to get done in 7 days or, a speed delivery. And that the awareness that came to me is you cannot force the river. You cannot force the river. So for some people, they might feel back to an equilibrium in 2 years or 1 year. And for me, it took 5 years. So after living in this kind of very quiet lifestyle, I moved back to Honolulu. And I'm going to say it was there that I returned to my faith community, my home church. And I worked with an outreach program for baby boomers, since I'm a baby boomer. And a lot of baby boomers, as you know, have left the so-called religious establishment, in the 60s and 70s. And then what started happening is, fast forward, as they became adults and had their own children, they started moving back because they wanted their children to have some kind of spiritual foundation or religious foundation. So anyway, out of reconnecting with the baby boomers through my faith community, I saw the role of both this kind of, you could say, this intersection of religion and spirituality and how important that was. But it was my time on the Big Island that had allowed me to develop my own spiritual awareness, you could say, my spiritual well-being, if you will. And so that it could now merge in some ways with the religious establishment, which prior to this time, I had walked away from. So it was part of my own healing and reconciliation in many ways. I'm sorry, that's another big theme in my life.
And so did you feel like the first 40 some years of your life, you were at times a committed religious person, but you weren't in touch with your own spirituality?
I would say I would not use the word committed. I was, just through my upbringing, my family was very involved, and my mother especially, culturally. And an important, part of being the churches in Hawaii at that time were also ethnic communities. So the church that I grew up in were primarily Chinese American, and down the road there was a Japanese American church, and that was just the way it was. And an important piece for the feeling a sense of belonging for, I think, my parents' generation and for my generation. And then I would say that many of my generation kind of grew out of it. So I would say the religious upbringing was an important piece, but not as in committed. It was more, well, this is what the family did. And then when I was in my high school and I think my early 20s, like many of us of my generation, we walked away from that. We walked away from middle-class values and the religious establishment and the status quo.
But you had returned after a lot of grieving and slowing down and healing to your church.
Thank you. Very well said. Yes.
And how close are we to the beginning of
the end of life? Okay, so all right, we'll loop back to that. But let me say that okay, while I was here at this faith community, a very dear friend who was the senior minister at the time had suggested to me the possibility of going to seminary. And I want to be very honest with you that I really had no clue what that meant. I wasn't somebody who I thought really was academic. I love lived experience and real life experience. So going back to graduate school, again, was not ever part of my agenda. But I thought, why not? Let's take a look at it. I'm open. I went to Berkeley. They had kind of a weekend, kind of, check it out, ask questions. You can sit in some classes. And I found it rather interesting, to say the least, and much to my surprise. So let's just say, long story short, I ended up applying and was accepted. So I moved to Berkeley, and I had enrolled for what we call the Masters of Divinity program. And it's a very rigorous academic program, again, which I was not aware of. I had equated seminary with monastery. So I was thinking, oh, great, I'll have lots of time to just meditate.
Yeah.
So talk about a certain naivete. It was clearly like I had not done some of my homework. And yet at the same time, I will say, I think something, you see, deeper was going on, that something else was moving within my life. You could say, when I think that spirit begins to move within you, there's so many things that don't fall under logical linear. They're not understandable. In fact, they're a bit of a mystery. And it was always a mystery for me. In fact, the first 2 years I was there in Berkeley, I kept wondering, why am I here? What am I doing? And yet at the same time, because I felt like a fish out of water, I could feel in my heart of hearts that there was something I needed here. And in many ways, you could say my life was going through, it was being reshaped, is one of the ways to talk about it. And part of the program, I'm getting to the end of life, part of the program was we needed to do a field internship, meaning practical work. You could do a homeless ministry, you could do work in a church. I decided there was an opening at a hospital in Oakland, Summit Hospital, and it was to participate to do pastoral care. And I thought, how perfect. Because the summer before, I had also returned to Hawaii. I'm sorry, there are many subchapters for me in this whole story. I had returned to Hawaii and also worked at one of the local churches. And my quote unquote job at that time was to do hospital visits and home visits. So I would visit the church members who were in the hospital for whatever reason, or visit them at home and just be present and maybe do what we call talk story. It's just a phrase, a local phrase we have, which, we're just visiting. And I found that I loved this. And even prayer, which was something I had not been accustomed to doing, came very natural to me. And now you have to know all of this was a surprise, because remember, I had walked away from the church. So here I am back in this setting, and I'm still questioning and skeptical. And yet there's a part of me that is feeling very drawn and feeling very moved. And then I was getting feedback through the senior minister that the people I visited were very touched by my presence. So all of these things, sometimes work on a subliminal level. All right, by the time I get back to Berkeley and I'm doing this field ed at the hospital there, I'm assigned to the oncology wing. And here's where we're getting to the not just end of life, but people who are in a vulnerable position through some kind of disease or surgery, and where their life has been disrupted. So there's a whole space before even end of life occurs where people are now, they thought whatever was going to be the direction of their life has been thwarted, disrupted. Yeah. They thought they were going east and now they're going west. And so, and again, finding that I had a certain, I'm going to call it intuitive feel for this, and then develop this, again, practice before I would enter the room, of spending a few moments there of prayer, of quiet, of going within, and just allowing myself to be a presence, a loving presence, and an instrument of healing. And I can only tell you that what I discovered also was that these conversations with a total stranger, mind you, would often turn out to be so personal and intimate and that they would start sharing things that I was astounded. I mean, you might expect them to say things that if they had known you for 20 years or you were a good family friend.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, having again this kind of loving presence and a safe space, people often want to say things that are just on their heart or
Right.
in their minds and
Yeah.
know that they're not going to be judged and someone can hear them and still appreciate who they are. Well, I think because, again, I was in the oncology wing, knowing that these people were often facing a terminal diagnosis, much like my mother. And I felt that whatever quote unquote comfort, whatever sense of beauty I could bring or offer to them, or whatever conversation we might have that allowed them to see how amazing their life had been, that there were many things of great, whether value or whatever they treasured, or family relationships or accomplishments they had, to appreciate again the magnitude and beauty of their own lives was such a blessing.
Do you know where or how the phrase came to you to be an instrument of healing? Was that something that you heard in the church, or it was just there?
Well, I will tell you that it's actually a Saint Francis of Assisi talks about. There's a very powerful poem.
I have the poem pulled up.
Oh,
Do you
wonderful.
want me to share it with you so you could read it to us?
Oh, sure.
Great.
Okay, here we go. Saint Francis of Assisi. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Thanks be to God. So it's this whole thing about setting aside our own agenda.
Yeah.
And being totally there 100% or 1,000% as a healing presence for the other. And again, it is just, to me, I discovered it was one of the most profound, sacred experiences. And all I could tell you was that these people who were often, I'm going to say maybe in a little funk, before I arrived, you could see it, there was just sadness around in the space. And by the time I left, and I'm not going to say it had to do with me, it was really creating this healing presence and bringing forth a healing presence and allowing them to share something of beauty that was meaningful for them, that they would end up smiling. And I remember going in to visit a woman who, she had diabetes. They often would, let me know what was their condition. And so she had already lost one leg and she had just had surgery and lost her second leg. And you would think someone in that condition, to my way of thinking, would be in despair. And so this amazing woman, I asked her, I said, after a brief moments of introduction, said, would you like me to offer you a prayer? And she says, no, I would like to offer you a prayer. So to have someone in that physical condition, see, that to me was an expression of spirit, of her love. She was clearly connected to something much larger than her body and her physical condition.
Yeah. Wow.
So
And you received it.
I did. I did.
Yeah.
And so, that these things are also now totally spontaneous. There's no way you can plan for this, you know? You can't have your memo and walk in with your agenda and say, okay, now we're going to do XYZ with patient A. It's really being an opening. And I think it's possible for all of us to learn this. And if I think this is a piece, this is beginning to point to some of the kind of awareness. I think it first starts with an awareness to be brought into any medical setting would be part of a powerful to work side by side with Western medicine, because Western medicine, again, I think she received probably the best medical care.
Yeah.
There were no infections. She was able to perhaps still do things with the rest of her life, but to have this other piece of emotional and spiritual well-being is, I think, what some of the big missing is in our current medical system.
Yeah. This might be jumping ahead, but I'm wondering, in your practice of being an instrument of healing and of setting your agenda aside whenever you walk into one of these contexts, I'm wondering about how you regenerate your own reserves and what you do to be able to keep giving in that
Very,
way.
very important. And something, as I'm sure you're aware, our whole healthcare industry and profession has had to deal with over the past 2 years. I mean, we've had to deal with it anyway. Anyone who's constantly in a position of giving, whether you're a nurse or a chaplain or hospice care worker, how do we renew? How do we regenerate? And how do we replenish? I would say, first of all, there's no one right way to do it. It's different for everyone. For me, a lot of it comes through the ocean, being able to walk along the ocean, just to breathe in the salt air, to also swim. I grew up swimming and living and loving the ocean. So Mother Ocean is, for me, one of the best resources that I use. And thank God I have her available. So all the more need, again, for us to protect our resources, Mother Nature and Mother Ocean. Sometimes it's music. I remember even during the process when I lost my mother and I was now grieving, and just days where there was so much sadness. People talk about not being able to get out of bed. I would play music. Now, even then, I was replenishing myself because there was a huge loss. And there's certain kinds of music. I mean, for some people, it might be a light jazz. For me, I don't know if you know the artist Kitaro.
I don't think
Beautiful.
so.
He's Asian. I believe he's Japanese. It's a very ethereal, but it was like language of the heart. It spoke to me in such a way, and it touched both the pain and somehow this beauty. There was some ethereal beauty that was available through the music, again, with no words, just that nonverbal, somatic, in the body experience. And you know it when you feel it. That's the other thing. Because I think our body, and this is another piece, has a very deep wisdom, our body wisdom, which sometimes we have to learn to trust. So those are some of the ways I replenish.
I'm noticing for you the way that your healing work happens through dialogue a lot, prayer, speaking to people, listening to their stories, and then these practices you're naming that you use to regenerate are not about language.
Yes, that's right.
They're just, not that it's the same for everyone.
Right. But I think we all find ways to integrate. It's like when you go through a huge loss and there's that sense of wounding, there's a sense too of your life now somehow being fragmented. And sometimes those practices, the ocean, is a way of healing and bringing together again, of becoming whole, of integrating. So music is one of those, because it bypasses the left brain. I think it allows us to integrate. And it's not a mechanical process. I think there's something, again, it goes back to the mystery. There's something quite miraculous and something that happens beyond words.
Before we run out of time, I want to make sure to get a fuller picture of what your current practice looks like, what has grown out of your experience of your mother's cancer and death,
Yeah.
what you're doing
Well,
now.
first of all, what a huge gift. I mean, for my mother to have died the way she did, and for me to interact with her, and to and then also when my father passed away about 20 years after, and then my brother about 10 years later. So it was like, I'm going to say, a life curriculum that really was part of my education. In addition to the divinity school, I would say my experiences with them were really of a whole nother kind of substance and awareness that the textbook could never provide. So, would you ask me the question again?
What are you doing now?
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Well, I will even include this whole thing about, I know you asked me about spiritual midwife. It was through, I ended up working with a hospice agency for a while. And while I'm no longer doing that, I am available to friends and family because there are a lot of people maybe who are not going to end up using hospice services. And I feel like because now I have so much awareness that it's like a form of giving back. If my story can be a bit of a guide, something of inspiration to encourage others to trust the healing process, then I feel like, what a gift. And this is also where, in working with this one particular family, I'll just use that as an example, it's often looking to see what that family needs. So, for example, with them, this whole idea of being a spiritual midwife, being not only a healing presence, but they're listening to what was going on for them,
Yeah.
what was troubling, what was challenging for them. And sometimes even just asking those questions, allowing them to express themselves and what's difficult about this. And with this one family knowing that they had had a history of, I'm going to say, some unresolved conflicts, which is pretty normal, by the way, for a lot of families.
Extremely.
I thought, wouldn't it be amazing before their mother died to give everyone a chance to express some of it, but in a loving way and in a loving environment? So I created a ritual, which I called the Circle of Love. I had never done this before. And this is one of those times about being open to healing and the greater mystery that it just came to me that we should gather the family. She was in hospice, in a home hospice in a very beautiful setting. So in the afternoon on a Sunday around 3 o'clock, the family members, her sons came, the husband came, and I said, invite a few close family friends that are near and dear to her. So this is an example of some of the things of how I'm practicing now.
Yeah.
So knowing that music was a part of it, I had brought music and simply did some opening remarks about this would be a sacred time for the family and their loved one to share some of their most tender moments, their love for their mom, the gratitude,
Mm.
and also any forgiveness, any wrongdoings, but
Yeah.
really to express your gratitude for this amazing wife, mother. She was quite young, I mean, in her mid 50s. And
Mm.
so, she also had pancreatic cancer. So the family was aware again of the terminal condition.
Yeah.
And saying that in this space, knowing that while there could be great loss and sorrow, there could also be great beauty about appreciating their relationship with their mom. And I'm just going to say to you, it was the most amazing experience. The son who, and boys who are in high school are not accustomed to expressing their feelings,
No.
started just tears flowing, sobbing. And it was actually the most beautiful witnessing,
Wow.
both for this young man to express his feelings, his heartfelt, all the things that have been bottled up. And because again, our culture does not allow, I think, men and boys to express their emotions and feelings, to have this gift to his mother. And her husband was also able to do a very beautiful, just expressing his deep love for her. and all the years they had together. I'm just going to say it was so unexpected, because when these things are created, there's no agenda or script. Everyone also is moved to say whatever they say. And because they were also a very religious family. Now, so here's an example of what I would call the intersection of both a spiritual, meaningful ritual with their religious tradition.
Right.
So we ended this sacred time with a prayer. The associate pastor of their home church came, and I made sure he could participate and give the formal blessing.
Wow.
So we integrated, again, this is another way to integrate all the meaningful pieces. Now, here's the amazing thing. She had not eaten for several days prior to this. The next day, she was sitting up in her hospital bed, eating, enjoying a smoothie. She was active for the next week. And I call this an infusion of love.
Yeah.
So rather than the transfusion,
IV.
Not an IV of blood or whatever liquid food, but an infusion of love. And how powerful the life force energy in that. So this is also what I mean about there was nothing there I was forcing. That's the role of the midwife, that we're allowing and recognizing too that she and each one of the family members had some spiritual aspect of them that was a key component of this entire experience.
Yeah.
And then the other awareness that I've learned that is really important, even though the physical body of someone who is terminal is maybe shutting down, we know the organs are now failing. Even though the body is shutting down, the spirit within that person may be flourishing, may be expanding, may be becoming radiant for the first time and becoming center stage in that person's life. So it's just miraculous. Getting back to my father, who was very stoic and inscrutable, when he was dying toward the very end, and talk about end of life care, because sometimes, again, it is not a recipe. That's the other thing. Even though, you can talk about the stages of dying, it can be totally all over the game board. It's so unpredictable. So because he was in a great deal of pain, we rushed him to the hospital. And it was right near Father's Day. So I was already planning a Father's Day dinner for him. We had to pivot, change plans. And instead of having the family dinner at the family house, we did it in the hospital room. And simply thank God for takeout Chinese food. So we ordered, but here's the thing now about being flexible, right? You have to be adaptable and flexible because things change from moment to moment. So instead of family dinner in one setting, okay, now we're in the hospital room, which you bring the Chinese takeout containers. And we invited everyone to come around 4:00. So my father, who is somewhat heavily sedated, is laying back in his bed. Okay. And the family is arriving, and my mother, who had passed away, my father had remarried. So there's another whole piece of this story, when you have a stepmother. And I'm sitting on the foot of the bed. Almost everyone has arrived now. My two brothers, the grandchildren, and my stepmother and her children. Okay. So two different families. Well, my father sits up in bed, bright-eyed and lucid, looks straight at me, sitting at the foot of the bed, and says, would I say a prayer for him? Now, this is totally shocking because my father is not even what I would call religious or spiritual, and he's a very quiet man, never would reveal or show his feelings, not ever vulnerable. And I could tell his whole heart had opened up. And for him to make this request to me was not only an acknowledgement and appreciation of now all my training and my becoming.
Yeah.
It was so powerful because, again, the healing that took place, he and I had years of a lot of conflict and tension, that it was dissolved outside of time. It didn't take 10 years of talking to a therapist.
Wow.
I mean, there was just this instant moment of love
Wow.
and forgiveness and reconciliation.
Mm.
I was speechless for a moment. And then I had to gather myself, and I said to my two brothers and the grandchildren and my stepmothers and her kids, let's gather around Dad, and my biological family on one side of the bed and her family on the other side of the bed. So he's now surrounded by his loved ones, but it's like the entire arc of his life when you think about it. So I offered a prayer that simply acknowledged like the fullness of his life, that he got his job done, that he raised a beautiful family, that we were all healthy and living, lives of fulfillment. My brother also was a social activist for the Native Hawaiian indigenous movement, and my other brother, who's a surgeon. So, and to be able to acknowledge that he had then the privilege, the blessing of a second marriage and another family, but to be able to say all of that in the context of the wholeness of his life and how blessed he is and how blessed we each are. So, I mean, Claire, I don't think any of us could have scripted that. I couldn't have imagined that. So I'm just saying it was so profound and so sacred. And it was really, you could feel when we say spirit was in the room. There was so much love present. And that's what's available.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share before our time is up?
Yes,
such a beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, for just the space to share some of these things. I will say, I know that not every death and dying process is like this, but it is what's possible.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize again, even though the terminal condition may win out, like the disease will eventually run its course, and that patient may not be quote unquote cured, which is what the medical model would use that terminology.
Right.
And yet that person and the family can experience an enormous healing.
Yes.
That goes beyond the body and beyond words.
Yeah.
And experience this sense of acceptance and well-being, that all is well, that her death or his death was a normal and natural part of that person's entire life.
And the experience of healing is eternal.
Yes.
It doesn't leave when the person leaves the plane.
No end date. And to be able to have that experience that they can take with them forever, I say is a very profound and very beautiful and very transformative. Because it is, it's interesting, I will tell you, in speaking this now with you, it makes something else available for me. Because, sometimes I'm just in the act of doing it. But I realize this whole idea of being an instrument of healing is very much a part of being a spiritual midwife.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review in your podcast app. Cancer Talks is a platform for anyone who has been touched by cancer. Write to us at info@cancertalks.com if you have a story to share. If you'd like to be in community with other cancer thrivers seeking personal transformation, join us for free workshops on Zoom. Visit cancertalks.com/Zoom to register. If you're moved to donate, please visit cancertalks.com/donate.